All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Johnson-Smetesky. I am the Kraft Family Professor and Director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. And it's my delight to welcome you to our midday talk by our Corcoran Visiting Professor of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, Professor Jonathan Decter. So let me first quickly introduce him. Jonathan Decter is the Edmond J. Safra Professor of Sephardic Studies at Brandeis University. He completed his PhD at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America and is a specialist in the history, literature, and thought of Jews in the Middle Ages, with a focus on the Iberian Peninsula, the Islamic world, and the Mediterranean. Professor Decter's most recent book, Dominion Built of Praise, Panegyric and Legitimacy Among Jews in the Medieval Mediterranean, is the winner of the National Jewish Book Award in Sephardic Culture for 2018. His first book, Iberian Jewish Literature Between Al-Andalus and Christian Europe, was awarded the Salo W Prize for Best First Book in Jewish Studies in 2008. He's also the co-editor of 3 edited volumes and editor of the Journal of the Intellectual History of the Islamic World. So we're very happy to welcome Professor Decter and for his talk today on ranking religions in medieval Jewish thought. Jonathan?
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone here, everybody who's online. So first let me say one thing about my work in general, which is that I'm a medievalist, and I dedicate my work to understanding the transformations in Jewish thought and culture over the course of the Middle Ages, especially in Arabic-speaking environments. In other words, I'm interested in knowing that during this period, when about 80 to 90% of world Jewry lived under Islamic rule, and came to speak the Arabic language, became intimately familiar with Islam and Islamic concepts, the ways in which Judaism was transformed and impacted. I've written about literature and I've written about religion and other topics. In recent years, I've tried to hone in on the topic of religion itself. That is there a category for which Jews in the Middle Ages think of themselves as having something like what we would call a religion? It might seem kind of too obvious a question to ask, did Jews have Judaism? But some of you are probably familiar with the debate within religious studies that ask the question, when exactly did the category of religion emerge? And when did its various species, if you think of religion as an overarching genus, when did its various species come into being? It's been argued that rabbinic Judaism, and this is an argument that I largely agree with, did not identify, that the rabbis, at the very least, did not identify themselves as possessing a religion that was comparable in a meaningful way with other religions. That is, the rabbis divided people of the world into 2 main categories. They had Jews on one hand, and then this very large category, an encompassing category that Professor Langer and others have written about, known as the Meaning. And that could encompass Christians, idolaters, Jewish apostates, and so forth, without any real regard for differentiation, for gradations of difference amongst them. They had the same status for legal purposes, and any other types of divisions among them were largely elided. And in that vein, Daniel Byron has argued most famously in his book, Borderlines, that Jews were aware that Christians thought of themselves as having a category that encompassed religion, that encompassed practice and belief in the same category, and that the rabbis intentionally eschewed that category and decided to define themselves as an ethnos instead. That is, rather than getting into a game of comparison that would compare Judaism and Christianity as parallel religions, the rabbis decided not to play that game at all. They said, we are an ethnos, we are a religion, let's say, and we have nothing to do with each other. We simply cannot be compared. In a recent article of mine, which is this appeared last year in the Journal of Religion. It's entitled Al-Yahudiya, the Emergence of a Comparative Framework of Medieval Jewish Thought. I argued that a very profound and seismic transition took place in Jewish thought between the rabbinic period and the medieval period as Jews came to live in an Arabic-speaking and Islamic environment. And that much of the transformations of thought that characterized Islamic thought came to affect Judaism quite profoundly, and Jewish thinkers quite profoundly as well. Unlike the rabbinic period, they came to compare their system of beliefs and practices and exegetical practices and ethical codes and so on with those of other groups. And so they knew that there were lots of different groups in the world. They knew about Muslims, they knew about Christians, they also knew, by the way, about Hindus, they knew about Zoroastrians, they knew about Buddhists. They talked about another group that's simply called al-Andalus, which is sometimes translated as Brahmins, but doesn't really seem to correspond to a real group. They know about a vast range of groups. And they knew that those groups also had things like revealed books, that they also had prophets in some cases, that they also had laws, that they also had ethics, that they also had doctrines. And unlike the rabbis, the medievals went about comparing their own system with analogous systems of other groups. That is, even if their system was the only one that they saw as true, and all the other religions of the world were false, at least they looked something like each other. They were structured analogously. Just one happened to be true, and all of the others happened to be false. The reason that this took place is because there are a lot of reasons, but one of them is because Jews were speaking Arabic, and they became familiar with the category within Islamic and Arabic writing known as deen. Deen is the modern Arabic word for religion. People debate whether deen can easily be mapped on perfectly to the modern concept of religion. Some see it as anachronistic to say so. Others, most recently, Rashan Abbasi has argued that it's actually a perfectly good term to correspond to the modern term of religion. But Jews came to understand deen as a genus, and this genus had many different species. One of which was Islam, one of which was Nasraniya or Christianity, let's say, another of which was al-Yahudiyya. And they used it as an internal, what we call an emic category for self-description. And that represents the transformation from the rabbinic period to the medieval period. I'm not going to beleaguer this particular argument, but the talk I'm giving today is really an extension of the work that I did in this article, where I'm going to take for granted that Jews were comparing themselves with others with similar types of species, to ask a slightly deeper or closer related question, which is how did they go about ranking different religions? So, they recognize their distinctions among them. Do they rank them? Do they see some as superior to others? How, and more importantly, how are they perceiving proximity and distance with other beliefs and practices of other groups? The background here is, with the argument in general, Islamic thought and the Arabic-speaking world. Some of you are probably familiar with, actually, before that, let me point out that the idea or the fact that Jewish thought and belief and practice was comparable to that of others, it created a certain amount of anxiety. That is, like, if there's one true religion and then there are false religions, well, how are we supposed to know which is which, right? And this is a quotation from Maimonides in his work known as the Epistle to Yemen, where you see him thinking through this problem and recognizing that there's something that has to be addressed. So in this section, he's talking about Christianity and Islam. And he starts off and says, long after Jesus, a deen ascribed to him spread among the children of Esau. Later, there arose another, Muhammad, who sought sovereignty and obedience toward him. All of them sought to create a semblance of the religion of God, the tashbih, bi Allah, exalted, and he's writing in Arabic, by the way. But divine workmanship does not resemble human workmanship, except to an inexperienced person who has no familiarity with either of them. The difference between our deen and the deens that resemble it is the difference between a living, rational human and a statue produced out of marble, wood, or silver and gold, such that it forms the semblance of a human. And some of you recognize he's drawing on Aristotle's idea of mimesis. If one were to compare this law, Sharia, to the fabricated law, he would think that there was a resemblance between them, since he would find in the law of God things that are prescribed and permitted, and in this other one, things that are prescribed and permitted. And in the law of God, practices and acts of worship, and in the other one, practices and acts of worship. And in the law of God, commandments and prohibitions, and this other one similarly, and commandments, promises and threats, and so on. So what you see here is the use of a couple of terms. One of them is deen, and he sees there's our deen and their deen. A component of these deens is what he's calling law or Sharia. And under that, there are various things that can be compared systematically. And he knows that he has to do it, right? Prescriptions, prohibitions, practices, acts of worship, promises, and threats. And all of these are sub topics under the category of law. Here, he doesn't engage in any kind of ranking. He doesn't say this group is superior to this group. There are other places in his writing where you see that he adopts a categorization that places Muslims and Christians on one rank and others on another rank, essentially mirroring the Islamic concept of people in the book. It's going to introduce a few terms here before I go on. Many of you are probably familiar with this concept of Jews and Christians in Islamic thought being the people of the book. That is, they possess a revealed book, the Torah, and the Injil, the Evangel, or the New Testament. This overlaps somewhat with this category, Ahl-Dhimma, the people of protection, that is, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Hindus, and sometimes others, enjoy protection in the political sense. They have a right to dwell within Islamic territories and have a right to their property, their own practice of religion. Muslim legal thinkers divide up the world in lots of different ways. In some cases, you see them say, for all intents and purposes, disbelief is a single community. Al-kufr millah wahida. That is, Muslims are correct, and since everyone else is incorrect, they are one community. But that doesn't hold up in a lot of other categories. So if you ask the legal question, are Jews and Christians allowed to marry each other in Islamic territory? Then they often come back and say, no, they're not really one community in that sense. They're different communities, and they're not allowed to marry between or to inherit across religious lines. There's not agreement about these things, but these are the categories in which these questions are usually asked. The first major work that's dedicated to thinking through the legal implications of the people of the book is this work. It's actually laid by Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, Ahkam Ahl-Dhimma, or the laws or the rules pertaining to the people of the book. And there he adopts a very interesting type of hierarchy. So at the top of it, as you'd expect, are Muslims. And then he's going to have the people of the book. But within the people of the book, he ranks Christians as being closer to Muslims than Jews because they have more prophets in common. So Christians recognize Jesus as obviously the Son of God, but also as a prophet. And Muslims see Jesus as a prophet, and therefore he sees them as more proximate. Jews reject having Jesus as a prophet, and therefore they're further down. But then below that, you get Zoroastrians and you get Hindus, and then further still at the bottom, you get idolaters and sun worshippers and other types of groups. But what interests me here is this very practice of creating a hierarchy. It mattered which ones were closer to Islam and which ones were more distant. I'm going to share quotes of a couple of other Muslim thinkers and then go on to my main sources. It's often been said that it was in the medieval Islamic world that the art, the practice of comparative religion came into being. This is argued by Louis Massignon, S.D. Goithein, and others. That's because there was the emergence of a literary genre known as the books about al-milal wal-nihal, the books of different religious community and sects. This is the most extraordinary of them. From the middle of the 12th century. by the thinker named Safra. And in the beginning of the book, he lays out his own system of hierarchy and categorization. He says, our treatment shall cover Islamic sects and others who have a truly revealed book, a real revelation, as the Jews and Christians. After that, those with a book of a somewhat similar kind, or the semblance of a book, such as the Zoroastrians and the Manichaeans. Those who have penal laws and statutes, but no book whatsoever, as the ancient Sabians. And finally, those who have neither a book nor penal laws nor religious laws, such as the early philosophers, the materialists who believe in the eternity of the world, star worshippers, idol worshippers, and this group that no one's been able to identify historically called al-Barahima, who are known primarily for the rejection of prophecy. They reject the possibility of prophecy altogether. It's an entirely novel system of organization. It's extremely original and sophisticated. It's even been called phenomenological. He's not looking at categories such as doctrine or practice even, but something even more fundamental, whether a group has a book or doesn't have a book. It's his own system of categorization. And I have no evidence, by the way, that any Jewish thinker ever read this work. He was a contemporary of some of the people I'm going to be talking about, but I don't have evidence to read. One person I think was read, although I have no smoking gun yet, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that he was read in Spain, is this polymath named Ibn Hazm, legal works. He wrote literary works. And he also wrote a book, which he, in this genre of the Milal wa Nihal genre, and he dies in the late 11th century, so he's actually earlier than Shamba's time. He organizes the works, the groups, according to a very different system, and he doesn't even always have everyone that we would see as belonging to the same religion in the same category. He's organizing them according to basic doctrines that are in ascending order in proximity to Islam. So he says the groups that differ from the Deen of Islam are 6, which I will mention according to their graduated steps, maratib, of distance from us, al-bu'd, right? So see, I was using the very terminology of proximity and distance and stages or steps of gradation. Furthest away from Islam are those who nullify all truths. They don't believe that there is such a thing as truth. They're the original postmodernists. 2, those who hold that there are truths, but maintain that the world is eternal, that it has no governor or creator. Then there are people who believe that there are truths, that the world is eternal, and has not a creator, but an eternal governor. That is, there is an idea of like God who's overseeing creation, but didn't create things in the basic way that we usually think of, like out of nothing. And then he goes on and he says, those who hold that the world has eternal governors who are more than one, but they differ as to their number. So here he puts dualists, such as Manichaeans and Zoroastrians. He also puts Christians here because of the Trinity, the Trinitarianism. However, he does pluck off a group that he sees as truly monotheistic Christians and sticks them in category number 6. That's where he puts Arians, for example, when it comes to that. So not all Christians even fit in any one place. And then 5, you can see he's getting closer. Those who accept all these things, that there's an eternal creator, but they nullify prophecy. Here's that his book, his category, al-Barahima, again. And then finally, this is where you're going to get Jews and some Christians, those who hold that there is one eternal creator and affirm prophecy, though they disagree about some of them. Jews accept some that Christians, the Christians accept some that Jews do not, namely Jesus. So that's yet another system of categorization. All I'm trying to point out here is that they're very interested in this question of proximity and distance and come up with a lot of different novel ways of arranging them. What my research is about now is not only doing some of the spade work for this, because there's actually very little scholarship on this genre in Arabic or in Islamic writing to date. But I'm trying to look at how Jews came to think in similar categories. Where do we see the imprints of this mode of thought in Jewish writing? And so I'm going to show you just a couple of texts today. One of them is a Bible commentary from around the year 1000. It was written by a Karaite, a subgroup of Jews who lived, he was originally from the Islamic East. And then he migrated to Jerusalem as part of this movement of Karaites that called themselves the mourners of Zion. They went literally to mourn over the ruins in Jerusalem as a type of aesthetic and religious practice. He wrote commentaries on every book of the Bible, tens of thousands of pages, quite literally, verse by verse, doesn't leave anything without discussion. His commentary on Psalms refers to Psalm 139. And this up here is the Psalm, and then I'm going to show you how he unpacks some of the terms that appear there. And I put the key terms in bold. So the Psalm reads, "Surely, O God, you will slay the wicked, men of blood, away from you. For they speak of you for naught. Your enemies swear by you falsely. Lord, you know I hate those who hate you and loathe those who defy you. I feel a perfect hatred for them. I count them my enemies." So all of these bold terms, Yefet takes to mean as alluding to groups that would emerge in the future. Like King David knew all of this and received the Psalms in a spirit of prophecy. He had a prophetic experience when he wrote this, and he knew what groups would emerge in the future. So who are the men of blood who swear by you falsely? These are, of course, Ashab al-Quran or Injil, the people of the Quran and of the New Testament. Here he is internalizing the Islamic conception of people of the book, but just flipping it. Rather than in the Islamic view, Jews and Christians are people of the book. For him, it's Muslims and Christians who are people of the book. What do they do wrong? They're violent, they're men of blood, and they falsely swear by God. Not that they don't believe in God, they do believe in God, but they simply swear by him falsely. After that, and I think he sees this as existing in a type of hierarchy, below that, you have those who hate you. Who are they? The materialists and idol worshippers. Materialists believe they're a Dahriya, they believe essentially in the eternity of the world, and therefore that God is not truly a creator. And also those who worship idols. They're lumped together here, and they hate God. And then finally, those who defy him. They don't hate God, but they rise up against him in a certain way. And who are these? Al-Barahima. Those who deny revelation. They deny the very possibility of prophet. So here you see Yefet, through whatever means, I don't know exactly what those means are, has internalized the very type of hierarchic categorization that you see in contemporary Islamic writing, and most closely related to the Mutazilates. And I think more can be drawn out on this subject. Now, the last figure I want to talk about, and I've left myself plenty of time, and that's good because it's kind of a long and involved text. I'll just give you a moment of background. The work is most popularly known as the Kuzari. It's written by Judah Halevi, who lived in Spain in the 12th century and migrated to Palestine at the very end of his life. He wrote a great deal of Hebrew poetry, and then he wrote this other work in Judeo-Arabic, that is the Arabic language written in Hebrew script, that's known in Arabic as Kitab al-Rad wa Dalil fi Din al-Dalil, the book of refutation. It's a polemical work, and evidence concerning the lowly faith. And by there he's calling Judaism the lowly faith, because it often occupies a low esteem in the eyes of Muslims and Christians, and they live under political subjugation. In this book, it's staged as a type of debate. I know some people here know the work by Ramon Llull called The Book of the Gentile and the Three Wise Men. In that book, he says he based it on the Arabic Book of the Gentile, and some people think that this is the book that he was based on. But there's no conclusive evidence of that, but it tells a very similar story. And the story goes like this. And it's based on a kernel of reality. That way off in a place called Khazaria, over by the Black Sea, there was a king. And this king came to convert to Judaism. And we have no real historical record of how that took place. However, in the introduction to the book, Halevi says, I was asked to recount how his conversion took place. And he makes up the story in the form of a dialogue. So there's a king, and he has a dream in which he's a pagan king, and he has a dream in which he's told his intentions toward God are good, but his practices are not satisfying. God is not happy with how he acts. And he thinks this is a very important dream, and he goes off in search of an answer to the path that he should take. And so first he calls him a philosopher, and he thinks philosophers are pretty smart and they must be able to answer his questions. And the philosopher says, God doesn't know anything about you. God doesn't know that you exist, let alone is God sending you messages about how you should be behaving differently. Right? And so he dismisses the philosopher. After that, he brings in a Christian scholar. And the Christian scholar talks about Christian beliefs, and they get onto the subject of the Trinity. And then the Khazar king simply says, that doesn't make any sense. Right? And in fact, Halevi, you can feel Halevi being a very heavy-handed editor throughout, because he has a line where the Christian says, we profess the divine unity, although the Trinity appears on our tongues, right? So he says it in this very backhanded way. So then he dismisses the Christian. And then he brings in a Muslim scholar, and the Muslim scholar tells him about the Quran and its miraculous nature. And then the king says, well, this argument doesn't really hold up, because what you're saying is that the miraculous nature of the Quran is evident because of the beauty of its Arabic, and I don't speak Arabic, so you should be able to convince me as a non-Arabic speaker about the truth of your claim. So he dismisses him as well. And then he says, well, I wasn't really planning on bringing in a Jew, but lo and behold, he brings in a Jew, and he says, I wasn't going to bring them because they're so lowly and subjugated, and they must be wrong. And then he brings in a Jewish scholar, and the Jewish scholar convinces him, of course, of all the truth of Judaism. And then the king goes off and converts. He circumcises himself in a cave, and then he comes back and he converts some of his people to Judaism. That's book one of the Khuzari. And that's about as far as anybody goes in reading it. What I'd say about that first chapter is that it follows a type of hierarchic organization where he's moving from the philosopher, who's the most distant from Judaism, to the Christian scholar, to the Muslim scholar, and then finally to the Jewish scholar. So I think that that arrangement follows in some ways that of Ibn Hazm. And it was suggested over a century ago that Halevi may have read Ibn Hazm's Kitab al-Milal wal-Nihal. The timing works out, the location works out very, very well. He undoubtedly knew his literary stuff, so I think it's quite probable that he knew this work, or at least something about it, some of his. All of these characters don't exactly disappear in the rest of the work. They don't show up anymore, but their ideas and their presence is always lingering in the background. A very interesting development takes place in book 4. The one piece of background evidence you need to understand as pastors is a section in the book of Kings, 1 Kings chapter 12, the story of King Jeroboam. I don't know if you guys know it, but basically, after the death of Solomon, there's a power struggle for kingship, and it's between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Rehoboam is, according to the Bible, the rightful heir, and he sets up a kingdom in the south, in Judah. But then Jeroboam goes north, and he breaks off and creates his own independent kingdom, so that you have, rather than a united Israel, you have the kingdom of Judah in the south and the kingdom of Israel in the north. And Jeroboam knows that he has a problem, which is that everybody living in his territory really esteems Jerusalem, and they want to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So what does he do? He sets up a rival cult in 2 places, in Dan, at the very far north of Israelite territory, and at Beit El, at Bethel, which is close to the border of Judah. And in these places, he sets up famously 2 golden calves, right? People probably know the golden calf story from Exodus, but the calf comes back. Many biblical scholars think that these are the calves that come first, and the Exodus story is made up to refer to it. And so he sets up calves, and he says to his followers, this is the God of Israel who took you forth out of Egypt. So it's a very complex thing, just like in Exodus. It's not, the question is it idolatry or is it not idolatry? Many would argue that it's not, that the followers of Jeroboam remained monotheists. They believed in the one God. They just prayed toward an object. And medieval thinkers go back and forth about whether they think this constitutes idolatry or not. The other thing he does is he sets up his own place of worship for these calves, and he sets up his own priests who are not descended from Aaron, so they're seen as illegitimate priests. He burns incense, and they have a whole host of rituals around these calves. So it's a break off. Part of my project is a full chapter on Jeroboam and medieval interpretation. This is one little piece of it. So without further ado, let me try to walk you through this argument. It goes on for about 3 screens, so bear with me. So this is a conversation between the Jewish scholar and the pagan Khazar king, who's now, by the way, converted to Judaism. And they got on the subject of Jerusalem. And the Jewish scholar said, Jerusalem is the true direction of prayer, since it is a divine place, and the Sharia, the law, or the religion that comes from it is the true religion. Judaism is true because it comes from Jerusalem. And the king says, the religions that came after ours affirm the truth and do not deny it, since they all esteem this place, and they say that is the place from which the prophets ascended, the portal of heaven, and the place where the souls will gather for resurrection. They also affirm prophecy among the children of Israel, in addition to esteeming their forefathers. They affirm the act of creation, the flood, and most of what is in the Torah. They make pilgrimage to this revered place. So the king is saying, look at how much Christians and Muslims esteem Jerusalem, and they recognize so much about Judaism that is true. And then the scholar comes back and he says, I would have likened them to proselytes, with the Iberian Hebrew, who do not accept all details of the law, but who do accept its general principles, had their deeds not contradicted what they profess. So already there's something very fascinating happening where he's comparing this category, the rabbinic category of the proselyte, somebody who's moving toward Judaism but has not become a full-fledged Jew yet. Christians and Muslims are a lot like them, except that they don't do exactly what they profess. There's something wrong with their action, their mode of worship, and he's going on to say what that is. They claim that they esteem the place of prophecy, but direct their worship toward places where there were idols, places where their masses happened to be present, but where no divine sign was seen. They preserve the vestiges, rusum, or you can also translate that as custom. It's another way to think of it. The vestiges of ancient idolatrous worship, as well as the ancient pilgrimages and ceremonies. They did not change them apart from the images that were there. So in Islam, some of you may know that there was a belief that the Kaaba, to which Muslims worship, had housed idols, and that when Muhammad came along, he cleansed it of the idols, and some maintain that he didn't even do that. Some people in the Middle Ages think that there's still idols sitting in the Kaaba. But for Halevi, he's saying, at least they changed that. They got rid of the images, but they didn't change anything else. They eradicated the images, but did not eradicate their vestiges or their customs. They kept worshiping in the same place in the same way as they did when they were idolaters. And that for Halevi is tantamount to idolatry itself. It's almost as bad as truly being an idolater. And it's at least enough to undermine the claim that they are close to Jews. And they would have been close to Jews had they just professed monotheism and worshipped in reasonable ways. But because they've continued to venerate the places of idolatry, using the customs of idolatry, they should be seen as very distant from Jews. And then he has a little poke where he thinks that there's a biblical verse that refers to those who worship their gods, wood and stone, that the wood and stone refer to the crucifix and to the stone in the Kaaba itself. But they're not done. And then the Khazar king says, but they are closer to you than the philosophers. What I notice here is Halevi's adoption of this categorical thinking of proximity and distance regarding other groups. It matters whether the philosophers are closer, like let's say whether Aristotle, who believes in one God, is closer to Jews or whether Muslims and Christians are closer. And so the king presumes that they are closer. And then the Jewish scholar comes back and says, one who engages in philosophy is as distant from those who claim revelation as those who claim revelation are from us. These religious communities have become distant. They've become distant to the same degree that they had been near. So in its pristine form, Islam and seemingly Christianity also is fairly close to Judaism. They look like their practitioners look like the Gary, like the proselytes. However, because they continue to venerate these places of prophecy, of idolatry in idolatrous ways, they are in fact very far from us. And now he has to work Jeroboam and his story into it. And he says, indeed, Jeroboam and his faction are closer to us than Christians and Muslims, even though they practiced foreign worship, Avodah Zarah. Why are they closer? Because they were Israelites. So even though Jeroboam set up golden calves and had everybody worshiping toward these calves, they are closer to us than Muslims and Christians because they practice circumcision, they observe the Sabbath, they practice most of the laws, and so on. I won't go on and read the rest of that quote. But then the Khazar king comes back and asks yet another follow-up question. Are there meaningful gradations of difference between the various rebellious groups in the Bible? So here he refers to distinctions should be made between the faction of Jeroboam and the faction of Ahab. And you know about Ahab, he actually set up high places of worship and worshipped, didn't set up calves to represent the God of Israel, but he just went and worshipped Baal. He just went and worshipped the God of Israel's enemies and neighbors. So in the king's view, there should be differences to be made between Jeroboam and Ahab, who were categorically worshippers of Baal and practitioners of foreign worship. Certainly nobody in the rabbinic period, as far as I know, really thinks about a question such as this. But then the Jewish scholar, who's probably Halevi's mouthpiece, comes back and questions the whole type of thinking. He says, you've called attention to a subject for which there is doubt, though there is no doubt for me concerning it. We have digressed from our aim. In other words, we've gotten off the subject. So the king is maintaining that lots of different types of differences should be recognized among idolaters. But the Jewish scholar comes back and says, no, I don't really think so. They all seem to be one community of disbelief. And most people identify the Jewish scholar as representing Halevi's true view. I'm not sure if that's the case, but what you certainly see in a text like this is Halevi thinking through a problem of his age, which is how one should categorize different religious groups. And I think by adopting this language of proximity and difference, the idea of stages of degree, we see the very deep imprint of Islamic thinking about religion on Jewish thought. So this is all I'm showing you today. I mean, there are aspects of Maimonides that tie into this as well, and some other figures. But I'll stop there. Right on time, I believe. Yes, 1 minute to spare. I said 12 already, so I wrapped up 1 minute. What are your questions?
Right.
He's in charge. I'm not. They will be fielding this.
Waiting to get spotlighted here, but thank you, Jonathan, for that presentation.
You need to turn your camera
Try it. Anyhow, you'll just hear my voice if you're online. We can start with some questions in the room. And then maybe we can take some online questions as well. So do we have any in the room questions here? Yeah.
Thanks so much for a great talk. I was wondering about the category of Jeroboam, and is there any sense, could that be a stand-in for Samaritans? Or Samaritans a category in Halevi's mind?
He doesn't say much about Samaritans, so I'll say something about Samaritans first and then more about Jeroboam.
Great.
It turns out to be even more interesting than you possibly meant.
Yeah.
So when you read Muslim heresiologists, they usually categorize the Samaritans as somewhere between Jews and Christians. So they maintain the same book with few changes. They recognize the same prophets, but they don't, except that the Samaritans don't identify some of the prophets that Christians do. But that's always the frame. Where do they fit between Jews and Christians? When Jews write about the Samaritans, they usually say that they took over things from Christianity. So they see them more as an offshoot that's closer to Christianity. So one thinker I didn't talk about today is another Karaite I learned about yesterday, Yaqub al-Kirkasani. Al-Kirkasani wrote a big work of the law. He was also a Karaite. And the book starts off with the heresiography of different groups that broke off at different times. So what he does is he identifies Jeroboam as the original sect. It's the first thing to break off from Judaism. And he went and he created a rival cult. In his view, the rival Jewish group, known as the rabbinics, are the descendants of Jeroboam. And he believes that their practices are following the misguided practices of Jeroboam and his faction. Now, where it gets yet even more interesting, I think, is are places in Jewish writing where Jeroboam is identified, or not literally, but as having done something akin to what Muhammad did with Islam, because Jeroboam changed the direction of prayer from Jerusalem to Beit El and to Dan, came up with false priests and false rituals, and stopped pilgrimage to Jerusalem. There's one text where it says this is just like it's actually a dictionary that it's the heading under the root Bet Dalet Aleph, which means like to fabricate, to invent. And he says this is bid'ah, right? And like with an ayin in there. Right? This is religious innovation, which is frowned upon, to change proper religious observances, false religious observance. And he says Jeroboam did this because in the Hebrew in Kings it says that he fabricated these new rituals from his heart. And he said, and this is just like the Ishmaelites do today because they pray 5 times a day and because they fast in time. And he's very explicit. They fast the time of the month of Ramadan. So Jeroboam becomes a prototype, not so much of the Samaritans, but actually of Islam.
I want to alternate to an online question, then we'll get to you. I have to unmute myself. No, I don't. Ernie Rubinstein's. Excuse me. So Ernie Rubinstein asks, thinking about Shastrani's reference to early philosophers as hierarchy of religions, and if Halevi's reference to philosophers who speak to the Khazari king, would you say that philosophy counted for some Muslims and Jews as religion in its own right? Was philosophy a deen or something in competition?
That's a very good question. So it often gets treated with in the same type of way, just like in Halevi's. I think that they say that there's a great deal of overlap, but it is not in itself a deen. And he's more interested in the question of those who engage in philosophy, and those can be people who belong to different deens, right? You can have Christians, Jews, and Muslims, any of whom could engage in philosophy. It's just an independent category. Now that said, they know that philosophers have certain beliefs that are central within the deans, such as the belief in there being a first cause of the universe. So Aristotle, in his own strange way that would be that pose a lot of difficulties for religious thinkers, was a kind of monotheist. He believed that there was a first cause that gave, not in time, not like literally through creation, but there's something without which the universe would not exist. And God is the first cause in that sense, and the universe perpetually exists because of the existence of that cause. This is an idea that many medieval thinkers, Jews, Christians, and Muslims found extremely attractive. That by way of it, they could prove the existence of God. That answered your question. I don't see you. So can't even see your expression.
Thank you very much. I apologize that I missed the beginning. But I am particularly intrigued by what's at stake in the metaphor of proximity or distance. And I wonder if you could talk about that some more. On the one hand, it seems to be something associated with truth, which you mentioned specifically, but I wonder if it also has ramifications both in terms of identity and outcome. That is to say, it has political ramifications. It has presumably theological ramifications in terms of what's at stake. If you are closer, do you get good stuff like paradise, or farther away you don't? I mean, can you sort of?
These are excellent questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think that there are legal implications, and there are, as you term them, political implications. Now, political in the sense, of course, Jews don't have sovereignty; they don't have a state in the Middle Ages. But it doesn't mean that they didn't think about having one, right? So they kind of fantasize about the future of the Messianic age, when there's going to be a Jewish king, and everyone's going to recognize him. And then the question becomes, well, who's going to get to live in this territory under this idealized king? So when Maimonides writes about it, he completely adopts the terminology, the categorization of the people of the book. Right? So Muslims and Christians are actually tolerated in this future Jewish state, whereas idolaters are not. So that type of categorization is very important for them. Where he's much less clear, I have several texts in the presentation I could show you, is in a general sense, who's closer to Judaism, Christians or Muslims? And he tends to answer that question in a very localized way. So when he's given particular questions, he gives particular answers. And in some cases, Muslims seem closer, in other cases, Christians seem closer. So when he's asked the question, are Muslims idolaters? Like Halevi seems to be implied, right? Are they idolaters because they engage in certain rituals and pilgrimage? I don't know if you're familiar with this moment where Muslims on pilgrimage will throw stones at pillars, right? And so to a lot of Jews, this looks like a form of idolatry, or worship, or touching the black stone of the Kaaba. That looks like idolatry. So my mind's asked the question: are Muslims idolaters? Which has particular legal implications. Can you drink wine that they may have touched? And for that, he says, no, Muslims are not idolaters, even if they practice these rituals that derive from idolatry originally. This isn't what they have in mind when they're performing these rituals. They only have their mind set on the true unity of God. And because they are real monotheists, the implication being that Christians are not real monotheists. They are not idolaters. But by implication, because Christian entertaining of the idea of the Trinity, they do seem to be idolaters. When Maimonides is asked a different question, is it permitted to teach the Torah? Is it permitted to teach the Bible to non-Jews? There's a rabbinic passage that says somebody who does so is deserving of death. He says it's not permitted to teach it to Muslims, but it is permitted to teach it to Christians. The reason being, Muslims believe that the text of the Hebrew Bible has been falsified, and therefore there's no meeting of the minds. They can't engage in a real conversation about it because they don't accept the revelatory status of the text as Jews do. Christians, however, although their reading of the text is extremely different, there's agreement about the text itself, and therefore you can teach the text to Christians and try to move them toward the proper reading of the text. So, there's a case where there's real legal implications. But I don't think Maimonides has a general concept of what group is close or further. Because I say that there are legal implications and also political, but in the sense of a state that doesn't exist.
No, it would have been possible just to say, well, this is a hierarchy, and this is on top, and this is the one. But the notion of proximity adds something else. It seems like there's more to it there.
Yeah, I want to give it more thought, but I really appreciate the question. I have thought a lot about why does Halevi care? He doesn't draw a distinction, interestingly, between Muslims and Christians. He seems to lump them together. And I think only that difference over against true idolaters is meaningful. But I think you really probably wrestled with that question of whether Israelites who follow the basic laws but worship toward graven images were closer or further, and he had to make a decision about that.
Well, in some sense, what you said about you get a different answer if you ask a different question. This allows more flexibility than a hierarchy, simple hierarchy.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Another online question, this one from Scott Gladstone, who says that it seems that Halevi is thinking in terms of Judaism is in its pristine form as opposed to how it's practiced, I think in Halevi's era, compared to the other religions in practice, which doesn't seem fair. Besides what the Khazar points out, we know that pre-modern Jews still held onto idols, or ancient Jews perhaps, and were very preoccupied with rituals to ward against the evil eye that seemed fairly like idol worship. So it seems that Muslim authors who categorize others were more fair and looking consistent with the pristine forms of religions being compared. So I think there's two questions here. What type of religions being compared, a pure form or a practice form? And there's a question of fairness and judgment.
Good. Okay, so on the first part, the quote that I gave you, I actually cut off in the middle. And so just after the Jewish scholar is denigrating the Muslims and Christians for their idolatrous ways, the rabbi or the scholar goes on to say, we veer more toward them every day. So he does recognize that there's something wrong with the Judaism being practiced. It doesn't say exactly what it is. But I think the bigger problem, and I think this is what the second part of your question refers to, is what I call the specter of idolatry. So idolatry is it's an insult that all religious groups like to fling at other religious groups. And no one ever identified themselves as an idolater. Even the people that we would think of as, or they would think of as, they've got some god here, and it represents a celestial organization of star, a constellation. Even the grossest forms of idolatry, they're not really worshiping the thing. But what Halevi knows and what Maimonides knows is that if you look back at ancient Israelite worship, there were cherubim, there were cherubs that stood in the Holy of Holies and were graven things toward which people prayed. There's no question that was part of Israelite practice. And so they have to deal with this question: what exactly does it mean to pray toward a thing? Does that disqualify one from proper worship or not? So, okay, we can all agree that worshiping toward the golden calf is a form of, it's improper worship. Well, why is it proper to pray toward the Holy of Holies that have the cherubs there? Isn't that look a lot like a form of idolatry? And so Halevi, you see him writing about it. There are other parts of history, he writes about this pretty extensively. And he says, in the end, the only real difference is that God commanded this one and didn't command that one. Like, that's what it comes down to, right? He knows that deep down, Israelite worship didn't look that different from the worship of the idolaters. It's just, this is the one that God supported. Maimonides has a very famous theory of it's known as the divine roots, that God recognized that if he took the Israelites out of Egypt and said, you should all worship me only through prayer and the power of your minds, then nobody would have followed that. There would have been no winning Israelites over to proper worship. So instead, he did it by stages. God said, here, let's redirect your mode of practicing toward me. You can keep doing the strange things you do with sacrificing the animals and burning the incense or whatever, but as long as you're directing it toward the true God, that's okay. As long as you're no longer worshiping these other gods. This is, of course, something that polemicists against Judaism are very well aware of. And they say these were commandments that God gave to the Jews out of wrath. Right? God knew that later on the Jews would reject Jesus and reject Christianity. So God gave them all of these commandments, not just sacrifices, but other stuff too, because of their future sin. And I think Maimonides is certainly aware of this mode of polemic, and he responds to it as best he can, which I think is to say, this was all part of God's plan. It was there for a while. There are better forms of worship. Prayer was better than that. Silent meditation is even better than prayer. And it was through this type of gradual behavioral therapy, you might say, that God brought people toward proper worship.
Please, Jason.
Perhaps continuing on the fairness theme, you've got Christian writers like Theodore Abou-Qurbra that try to set out at the beginning of treatises their criteria for right religion, the manner of its propagation and universal scope and blah, blah, blah. And a first semester freshman will look at the criteria and say, it seems like these were constructed so that Christianity is going to be ranked the best. Have you found any attempt to objectively in the texts you're looking at set out these criteria separately, or must it be intuited from the later comparisons about proximity and distance?
True question. So they are never dispassionate scholars. They're never not that anyone is, but like they don't even pretend to be, let's say, objective viewers of these questions. Their intent is always polemical and is always apologetic. They're always defending the wrong. So if I were to compare the Kuzari, let's say, with the Book of the Gentile, the premises completely set up Judaism and Christianity to win the argument in each case. And so in the Kuzari, the king's dream is that his intentions are good, but his practices are not. And so that allows for the religion that's going to follow God's true intent for practices, that's going to be the victor, right? Whereas in the Gentile and the three wise men, it's salvation, right? The king is worried about his impending death and life after death, and then the religion that's going to provide the most satisfactory answer, however objective the text may seem on the surface, I think Christianity wins because of the setup of that question. I think that's always going to be the case. So I don't think that they're bad. What's interesting is that in the process of this type of polemical argumentation, lots of interesting gradations of categorization come into being. And so, whereas the rabbis didn't really ask these very nuanced questions about this group or that group, I think that the medievals do, even if it starts off with a polemical.
That's the effect of being near.
No, I think it's the anxiety of proximity. Right. I think that it's not the truly distant groups that are worrisome. It's those that are proximate.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Kind of like related to what you were saying about proximity. Is there a difference, like historically, when the Jews were living with Christians, and the Christians were maybe persecuting them, or when they were living with Muslims, and the Muslims would be nice to them? I don't know. Is there a difference in how they then rate, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, so the follow-up of this part of the project is to see what the longer-term effect of this type of thinking is in Jewish thought after Jews leave Arabic-speaking Islamic territories, especially for those who are the inheritors of this tradition. And I see a lot of things going on in late medieval Jewish thought being executed in Hebrew that grows out of this. I don't know if I can identify it with persecution or lack thereof per se, but I do think it has to do with different social circumstances. So famously, Jewish law becomes more permissive on the question of whether they can deal with wine that's been touched by non-Jews. In Christian territories, this becomes more greatly permitted out of a kind of necessity. I was going to make
What about the Karaites themselves? And so you were citing Karaites as within this intellectual tradition. But certainly when I was trying to discern what the term meaning was being used for, one of the categories that was crossing my consciousness, and it was complicated, was precisely Karaites who were inside and outside at the same time. And I think other groups also, but it becomes very complicated.
Yeah, I think it's extremely messy. I think Reno Rusta's argument that the pronouncement of apostasy is made based on politically contingent circumstances is very fair. It's not simply that the Karaites were simply Armenians or simply Jews. It's that when there was an impetus of some sort to proclaim them the apostates, they did.
That might be a good place to end it with a sense of a preview of where your work is going. So this was a great introduction, Jonathan, to your work and what your time here at Boston College of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning is going to be about. We look forward as a preview to your conference that you'll be organizing in the spring semester, which perhaps some portions or keynotes will also be available in a hybrid format. A link for this talk will be made available. And we bid farewell to our friends online who joined us from around the world. And folks here in the room can still stay and gather for conversation and refreshment. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.